Good evening. I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of Santa Monica City Planning Commission for October 19th, 2022. It is now 5:31. If I could ask staff to give a roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Fonda-Bernardi?
Here.
Commissioner Fresco is absent, and Commissioner Lambert is absent. Commissioner Landris?
Here.
Commissioner Tolkien?
Here.
Commissioner Raskin?
Here.
And Chair Reese.
Here. Next on our agenda is the Planning Commission or Planning Director's report. Do we have one?
Yes, good evening, Chair Reese and Planning Commission. Coming up at your next meeting, which is on November 2nd, will be further discussion on the housing element, implementation of red lines, focus on AHPP and density bonus, and then also a development project at 2668 2nd Street. The project has a major modification and a CUP. Following that meeting, second meeting of the month will be November 16th. In further discussion on the housing element implementation, and then also recommendation on use of outdoor space on private property. So that's related to the use of parking lots and things like that for outdoor dining and various other uses. City Council actions, nothing since our last meeting, which was just last week. So I updated you on what happened at the last meeting already. Upcoming City Council items, next Tuesday, October 25th, we have the Home Share Amnesty Program, as well as a Parklet study session. And then the City Council meeting regularly scheduled for November 8th has been canceled. That's election night, so they won't be meeting that night. Element updates, following the City Council's approval of the plan last Tuesday night, it was immediately submitted to HCD, and then on Friday, the city did receive the certification letter from HCD. And as we talked a little bit about last week, but just to give you an update, the city has now received 16 of the Builder's Remedy projects. With the adoption of the housing element and HCD certification, obviously the door is closed, so we will not be getting any more of those projects, but we do have a total of 16. We are in the process of figuring out really what the review process will be for these projects. City planning staff is working closely with the city attorney's office to really get a handle on, again, how these projects will be reviewed and kind of what happens next. So we will keep you posted on that as we get more information. And then just a reminder, it's that time of year again for cybersecurity training. So the ISD department has let us know that there are people who haven't completed their training yet. And it's important that that be done by the 24th. Otherwise, ISD will remove access system. So if you haven't done that already, please try to get that done by the 24th. And yeah, the instructions are on the city email that was sent to you on October 3rd on how to complete the training. That concludes my report. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Sorry, Commissioner Fonda-Bernardi.
Two questions. How long was the window that we were exposed between the date that we were supposed to be approved and the date we got approved of our housing element? How long did that last?
But the whole time we were out of compliance, which was the date when that originally kicked in, Jing?
Well, the statutory deadline was actually October 15th, 2021. So, but the city didn't get that formal notification until February the 8th. But really, our period of have an adopted housing element, a compliant, a certified housing element by October 15, 2021, the city was already out of compliance.
I see. So you're suggesting we've been out of compliance for a year. Is that
basically, yeah.
Meaning we were
and it was just within the last, we received the bulk of the projects just within the last couple of weeks.
Right.
even though they could have filed them sooner.
Right. And what is the total of units that we're talking about?
Total number of units is 4,562. And of those, 941 are affordable.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Landris.
Thank you. Yes, it would be great if we could get an update of that memo that actually listed the addresses and the market rate and affordable breakdowns on those and whether they're SB 330'd or not. That would be super helpful. So I'd love to see that. It sounds like another 500 units came in between, I guess, Tuesday and Friday. So it'd be good to know where they are.
I can send that to the commission.
Okay, and then my other question is, I understand that Governor Newsom has announced that he's ending the COVID emergency as of February 28th. So, and I know that some jurisdictions are starting to think about bringing back their commissions and boards. Have we received any updates from council or the clerk regarding our obligations?
Not yet. That's what we'll be talking about over the next couple of weeks, and as soon as I have more information, I'll let the commission know. Okay,
I just want to make sure that that also, I mean, staff, I assume, is aware of this, but there's new legislation that was passed in this session that provides for temporary absences, participation by people who are, like, let's say you have COVID and you can't participate, but you're feeling well enough to join the meeting, there is now a process for hybrid attendance without having to Brown Act your front door and let people into your house. So I just, and also there's legislation that allows staff to add more materials to our packets before meetings inside the Brown Act deadline. So I just want to make sure that we're all read in on that, and particularly on the late notice of documents, that the public is really made aware of what the new laws are, because that could easily lead to misunderstandings.
Right. Yeah, we will make sure we're up to speed on all that. On the hybrid meeting, that could be a challenge from a technology perspective, but I understand what you're saying, and we will make sure we're up to speed and figure out how to do it if we have to do it.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this point? Okay. Not seeing any. We'll thank you for the report, and we'll move on to the next part of our agenda. So here I have two announcements. Public comment for tonight. Please note tonight's procedures for public comment. We are accepting real-time oral public comment by phone for each item. Please check the top of the posted agenda for the phone number to call once the caller queue is open for each item. The caller queue will open when each item is introduced and will close after the first 5 public comments are heard. Written comments are received up until noon today have been read by the commission. Comments received after 12 p.m. today will be considered as part of the record proceedings, but not posted online with the Planning Commission's agenda prior to the meeting. A second announcement relates to Blue Jean's moderator function. This is for technical assistance only. You cannot communicate with the commission. In fact, we can't even see comments on there. So again, it's for technical assistance only. Commissioners, do you have any other announcements at this point? Commissioner Landris?
Yeah, I just want to announce, as I announced before, that I was wearing my planning commissioner hat when I attended the UCLA symposium over the weekend in Arrowhead. It was a very interesting discussion about the housing crisis, and I think my takeaway is that we need much more integration of our housing goals, our sustainability goals, and our other equity goals. There's lots that's happening in silos, and it's not. I think there's an opportunity for us to think through, for example, how we can achieve our sustainability goals through more creative approaches to housing, including whether it's materials or technology or location. But there's a lot of work ahead. And I hope, and Santa Monica has been on the forefront of it, so I hope we can continue to be.
Great. Yeah, and I attended the same conference. I concur with what Commissioner Landers said. I think there was also a ton of emphasis put on furthering fair housing and how much work there is at that on that issue and digging into that and staying on top of it. I would also say that Santa Monica was kind of the talk of the town too, with the builder's remedy. So very interesting, and it was a good learning experience for, I think, both of us. Any other comments from commissioners? Commissioner Tolkien.
Yes, I just wanted to say I was very interested in the project that has 2,000 units, so I went out to the site, which I had guessed was the old Tyark property. It's an acre and a half, which is quite the density for 2,000 units. So interesting to see how they're going to get it on there.
Agreed. And with 20% affordable. Okay. With that, I think we are done with announcements, and we can move on to the consent calendar item. And we have 2 items on our consent calendar. Meeting minutes from the 21st. I'm sorry, from September 21st and 22nd. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Actually, can we stop for just a second? Is there public comment on this, staff?
You can have public comment on the consent calendar as a whole, just provide opportunity to do that. But otherwise, you can just do a roll call vote.
Okay, you cut out a little bit. You're saying that's not a required element. You can move forward with the motion.
Right.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Chair, I'm sorry. I apologize. I was not at the entire meeting on the 21st. But I was on the 22nd, so we should probably pull the 21st so I can abstain, unless anybody cares.
Let's, just because we've done it, let's go ahead and make an amended motion, please.
Yeah, my motion is that we approve them with 2 separate motions, so everyone can vote for whatever they attended.
Thank you.
Commissioner Askin?
Oh, just, I don't know how to do this formally, but just noting that the minutes for the 22nd indicate that I was absent, but I was actually there, so if we could just correct that.
Great.
Apologies for that. We will make that correction.
Okay. We need a second for Mario's.
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a first and a second. And we're going to take 2 votes, one for the 21st. We can have that roll call right now first.
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi?
Yes.
Commissioner Landris?
Yes.
Commissioner Tolkien?
I'm sorry, abstain. I'm sorry. The 21st time is, yeah, sorry.
Right.
Commissioner Tolkien?
Yes.
Commissioner Raskin?
Yes.
And Chair Reese?
Yes. Now a vote on 2B, the minutes for September 22nd.
I already moved that.
Yeah, I'm just looking for a vote. I'm sorry. To be more clear, can we get a vote?
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi?
Yes.
Commissioner Landris?
Yes.
Commissioner Tolkien?
Yes.
Commissioner Raskin?
Yes.
And Chair Reese?
Yes. Okay, we're going to move into study sessions, and the first one we have is 3A, a study session introducing discussion of objective design standards. We'll refer to forever in the future as ODSs. Projects, and so these design guards projects supported by a grant funded by the Southern California Association of Governments. If we get a staff report.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction and then turn it over to Steve Mizikami and Stephanie Reich, who are leading this project. Just to give a brief overview, this is a grant-funded project. We actually are not managing the consultant, SCAG is, but the purpose of the discussion tonight, we know this is the first time the Commission is having a discussion like this. We've certainly talked about objective design standards throughout the housing element, but not in a lot of depth or detail. So this is really an introduction to the project. We are not reviewing, we don't have standards for you to review or anything specific. This is very much an introduction and feedback from the Commission on kind of like high level aspirations, if you will, for like what we're trying to achieve. And that's more helpful to us at this point in terms of leading to the direction of this project. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve and to Stephanie.
Great, thank you, Jane. I'll wait for Stephanie to fire up the presentation.
Hello?
Yep.
Perfect.
There we go.
Great.
Oh, good.
So good evening, Chair and Commission, Steve Mizukami and Stephanie Wright from the City Planning Division. So tonight we'll be introducing the city's Objective Design Standards project, including the project's scope of work, and also to provide an intro on objective design standards, and also for the Commission to discuss how design standards should shape the buildings in our city. Next slide. Stephanie, you can skip to slide 4. Great. So the city, yeah. So the city was awarded a grant from SCAG, which provides technical assistance to cities within the region with planning and policy projects. This project seeks to establish objective design standards and also to help streamline review processes to help with the housing production in the region. The cities of Montebello, Santa Fe Springs, and South Pasadena are also participating in this project. AECOM is the planning consultant that Jing had mentioned, managing the project for SCAG, and is working with city staff on establishing objective design standards that will be tailored to each city. Next slide. Next slide.
Seems like there might be a little delay.
Okay.
Stephanie, did you want me to share my screen instead?
Are you seeing the name?
We're still on the same slide that he just asked you to move from, and you're breaking up pretty significantly.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, Steve. That's okay.
Okay, thanks, Jane.
I guess.
Okay, great. So this project will evaluate our existing development standards and also our review procedures. We'll review our recent housing projects to get a sense of what our current standards are and how our current standards are working, and also how the ARB helps to shape our projects. The project includes developing an online cost estimator tool for developers, and we'll also create objective design standards for us to potentially use in various commercial districts, zoning districts throughout the city. And the project will also integrate the anticipated changes to building height and FAR development standards as required by our newly adopted housing element. Next slide. So the project began in March of this year and is anticipated to conclude in spring and summer of next year, 2023. On August 22nd, the city hosted a virtual community workshop with approximately 32 participants. And this was to inform community members and stakeholders about the Objective Design Standards project. Public comments related to the BAP ranged from creating affordable artist workspace, limiting impacts to nearby residential neighborhoods, and also to simplify standards and remove overly complicated requirements such as the street types that are built into the BAP, as well as the flexible design standards as they currently are set up. And on September 19th, the Architectural Review Board held a study session on the ODS program and discussed the design features and concepts the board is most interested in seeing developed in housing projects. And Stephanie will be going into more detail on the comments that were shared from the board a little bit later in this presentation. Following this evening, AECOM will gather all the feedback that we've received and begin to prepare standards suitable for the BAP, the DCP, and the mixed-use boulevards. Upon completion of the draft standards, a second community workshop will be held in early 2023. This would be to share the draft materials, followed by another study session with the Planning Commission as well as the City Council. So next, Stephanie will be going over what objective design standards are and why they are important.
Stephanie,
The next slide to Stephanie.
Might be frozen.
Good evening.
Oh, there we go.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, we got you.
Perfect.
Oh, great. Good evening, Design and Historic Preservation Planner for the city. I'm excited about this project because we believe that at some point we will be required to replace the design review system with objective design standards. So this project will make recommendations for a variety of zones in the city with the goal of eventually having citywide objective design standards, and it will make it easier for applicants to understand, very consistent. It will streamline the process, and that is, in fact, the goal, is to streamline housing approvals. Next slide. So we have design guidelines, and we've included those in the packet. Those are, as you know, guidelines, and we have a design review process which is discretionary in order to administer those design guidelines. And so we have already included many design standards in the zoning code, including modulation, and we have other design standards for transparency on the ground floor, etc. This will be an expansion of those design standards, and that's what we're here to talk about and get your input on. Next slide. So this spells out the difference between guidelines and standards. We will be working towards standards that are very clear, that are a yes or no kind of administration, and that will be approved by the HCD in being very clearly able to be administered in that objective fashion. Next slide. So this is an example of, in the downtown, how we've embedded design standards in our code for many, many years. Prior to the DCP, we had a step-back system in the downtown that sometimes resulted in really good buildings and sometimes it didn't. I think as we moved into the DCP, we decided to move away from this kind of wedding cake design. Next slide. And we came up with a pretty interesting formula for facade modulation, which describes an area of modulation that has a level of flexibility but is also easy to administer. Next slide. And I think I'll turn it back to Steve for this. This is my part 2. So as you know, you've seen this slide very early on in the housing element. We're trying to do our part to address the housing crisis and to streamline housing. And so, as you know, there are many hurdles for housing development in California. The public process sometimes delays housing development, and we in Santa Monica have been very good at moving things to administrative review. Objective design standards would be a further streamlining of that goal. Next slide. These are some of the legislation that we are very focused on as we're approving housing development. As you know, SB 167, the Housing Accountability Act, has really fed into all the work of the housing element. SB 35 is the legislation that if we are out of compliance found to be out of compliance with SB 35, we will have to turn to objective design standards. And SB 330, you're also well aware of, we're receiving many projects under that legislation and reviewing those now. Next slide. And as you know, the state is generating housing legislation almost daily. This is a list of other legislation that we pay attention to. Thank you very much, Heidi, for helping us work through this. Next slide. And so we will be focused on a number of different zones. And the team, including AECOM, has been looking at the existing policies in order to figure out what is the best way forward on objective design standards. Next slide. So, here's what AECOM has found and what some of the goals are. As we mentioned, we'll be looking at developing a set of citywide objective design standards. That's what we're here tonight to talk about. Also included in the process of the work under the SCAG grant is improving our applications so that we can further streamline the process. Next slide. Okay, and now I will turn it back over to Steve.
Thanks, Stephanie. So we're going to be looking at a total of 4 zoning districts as case examples, with a focus on the Bergamot area plan, including 2 districts in that area, the Bergamot Transit Village and the Mixed Use Creative that will be getting increased height and FAR for housing projects as part of the housing element amendments. We'll also be studying the DCP standards using the transit adjacent district as it yields the greatest development potential for housing projects in the downtown area. And also we'll be studying the mixed use boulevard zoning standards, which share a similar neighborhood context in that area of the city along Wilshire Boulevard and Santa Monica, as well as Broadway. Next slide. So although the BAP intends to encourage new housing development while conserving space for artists and the arts community, There have been very few proposals for housing projects in that area since the plan's adoption. As we know from our housing element discussions, the current height and FAR are too low to support housing projects while meeting the city's affordable housing requirements. But we also hear from developers that the standards are overly complex and also need to be simplified. Next slide. So the housing element zoning changes will establish the new increased height and FAR for zoning districts in the map as well as citywide. This ODS project will be working in coordination with those changes as we look to establish appropriate design standards, help shape the overall building envelope. So listed here on this slide are a few of the existing design standards that we'll be studying in the map, which include the ground floor use and design, building modulation, and the street type design requirements. Next slide. For the DCP, currently the design-related standards include our active ground floor design, open space requirements, upper story setbacks, and our unbroken primary facade length. Next slide. And for the citywide commercial districts, the study of the MUB standards will help to inform potential standards that we can also apply to other commercial districts, such as the MUBL, the GC or IC, or the office campus district. And next, Stephanie is going to go over what we've heard from the ARB and also the discussion points for the commission this evening.
So we have, of course, talked with city staff about what we think, since we're administering projects all day long. Getting input from the entire team was important. We held a public workshop, which was very well attended, and we got some really thoughtful, really good feedback from the public on the objective design standards. And with the ARB study session, we also got some terrific feedback. One thing that was very important, well, there were a number of things that were very important to all of those groups. Some of those are listed here. The Architectural Review Board agreed that and gave some guidance to the team to start with the design guidelines that have been adopted in 2019, as they still reflect the work of the Architectural Review Board. And I just want to pause now, and we can go to the next slides to say that so these projects, this Jan's Court was one of the first new projects in the promenade. It's a very successful project, but I think we've moved away, as we mentioned, from that wedding cake design. The two projects that are shown here, the Design Review Board or Architectural Review Board was involved in. I wanted to suggest that, next slide, the Architectural Review Board has been really instrumental in making Santa Monica look much better than Los Angeles that surrounds us by, every time they meet on every project, really improving design. So our goal with the objective design standards will be to match the level of design that we have accomplished with our discretionary process. These two projects we wanted to highlight because we think the built project at 500 Broadway is truly one of the better projects in the city. Koenig Eisenberg designed, and we think the result is really great. At 1415 5th Street, there's not a plan to move forward with that project that Michael Filonis designed, but was also a great result of the entire discretionary system. So we wanted to put that forward. Next slide. These are some of the projects on Lincoln, some of which, I think all of which you've reviewed. I've had the Architectural Review Board. I've been involved in most of those, and looking at the transition of Lincoln Boulevard from a 1-2-story built environment to one that has hundreds of units of housing, I think is a really proud moment for the city of Santa Monica. Next slide. And on the top, you have the Arroyo 100% affordable housing project on Lincoln Boulevard. Below is 2929 Pennsylvania Avenue. That was the result of a development agreement. Also, we believe well-designed projects. We'd like to have your opinion on those as well. Next slide. And this is the project. Michael Falonis designed this project that has been entitled for that site that was mentioned previously, the former SciArc site in the Bergamot area plan. Next slide. Okay, so we can refer back to those slides as we have discussion. We, would like to get your feedback on what makes for a successful project. So, what are the concepts that you are most interested in capturing in the objective design standards? What are the existing principles, standards, and guidelines that that you really look for when you're looking at projects? Next slide. And what's the concern that you may have? One of the things that we've heard fairly consistently is that objective design standards may not allow for the level of flexibility and innovation that we've always seen in Santa Monica. We are looking at a variety of ways to provide that level of flexibility, and we can talk about that in a little bit. And then what if you also have some ideas for objective design standards that would help that level of flexibility, that would be helpful for us. Next slide. And in particular for the Bergamot area plan, what are things that you value that we want to really focus on and incorporate? Next slide. Similarly, for the downtown and commercial districts, we feel like the standards that have been adopted in the downtown community plan work really well. They, of course, work well with the discretionary review system that we have now. What else would you like to see in the downtown? Next slide. Okay, and next steps. So we will be having a public workshop right now that is scheduled for January 2023. AECOM and the whole team is has been very good about staying on schedule. So then we will come back to you sometime in the spring. Next slide. Okay. So Jane, if you might go back to the images and we can scroll through them as we talk. I just also wanted to mention a couple of things that the Architectural Review Board looks for. That's good. One is an overall design concept. That's something that we don't believe we will be able to achieve in objective design standards. So something like a design concept or other things that we might not be able to achieve with objective design standards, we can potentially include something in the application process so that we can use the application to augment the objective design standards. We've heard a lot of concern about flexibility, and there are a couple of ways that, and we've been talking in active conversations with HCD because they ultimately approve the objective design standards. One, you have an intent statement and then multiple ways of achieving that intent. So let's say we want to have an active ground floor, and we can have a laundry list of different elements that make for an active ground floor and ask for 3 out of the 5. So it's objective and yet flexible. We might also be able to find a way, standard by standard, to deviate from the standards so that there could be some level of administrative review, that it doesn't kick the project into a full discretionary review, but there could be some level of flexibility there. So that's something that we will investigate with the team and also with HCD as we move forward. I think maybe we should stop sharing the screen to start discussion and maybe go back to it if we need to.
Thank you for that presentation. We appreciate it. So, Stephanie, how do you want us to comment? Are you just generally on the design principles and then go through some of the specific areas? Or what would be the most effective for you?
I think if you could maybe first go around and say, like, what are your major concerns? What are the top line issues that you would like us to consider as we're moving through this process? And then we can get into more detail if you like, focusing on the Bergamot area plan, focusing on the downtown, or we can, any number of ways we can scroll through the guidelines that the ARB has adopted, and or you can say, like, very specifically what's important to you. We could also go back to the images and say, like, that would be good, you know, this or that would be good to get into the design standards. How would you achieve that?
I'm going to go with your first option, where we go around and try to get our initial thoughts out on this, and then we go through your slides one by one.
Excellent.
Okay, so commissioners, who is brave enough to start us down this path? Commissioner Fonda Minardi.
The ways of looking at it, if we really are just putting together a shopping list, it seems, is for everyone to put up their top 4 or top 3 and see where we go. Just do a quick round and see where we are. So if I were to come up with my top 4, it would be sustainability, which is really at this point solar collectors. It would be open space, private and public. It would be light levels, meaning are your units illuminated well, or some of them are down in the basement in effect. And the third thing would be landscaping, making sure that there is sufficient landscaping to make it a less, let's say, a less harsh environment.
Okay. Commissioner Landers.
Yeah, so I appreciate that that suggestion from Commissioner Fonda Bernardi. I was thinking in the same terms. My top, and I'm still learning, like, what makes this objective. So Stephanie, please help us refine our language here. But safety is not something that I saw anywhere in the handbook, and I think safety, sustainability, mobility, and accessibility. I'll be more specific about what I mean by that. I'm thinking on safety. I'm thinking about both gender-informed design and trauma-informed design, which are things. And there is research that documents the relationship between spatial design and safety and the sense of safety for people. When it comes to sustainability, I'm with Commissioner Fonda Bernardi all the way. And when it comes to mobility and accessibility, I'm thinking not just about like what's required by the ADA, but I'm also thinking about, you said this is Bergamot area plan. So we know that's next to a metro stop. We know that we've no parking requirements. So we would imagine that there are a lot of micro mobility devices, anything from a skateboard to a bicycle to a scooter we are going to hope are being used, and that actually impacts design of a building, because you want to make sure that people can walk. Can a person walking in a bike while a person walk into the property while a person using a wheelchair can walk out simultaneously without bumping into each other? Those are the kinds of questions that I'd like to ask in terms of elevator sizes, access to housing and commercial. And anyway, that's my top level. Those are my top level questions.
Okay, Commissioner Tolkien.
I would echo Mario's sustainability is so important, and having usable
Very
open
helpful.
space.
Thank
And I didn't see the sustainability part in your presentation, but I think it's a major thing. Things like overhangs and stuff like that can also add to sustainability in terms of shading, evaluating the site in terms of the sunlight, and then maximizing, solar panels and things like that.
Okay, thank you. I would say that my big design folks would take in a slightly different direction. I'm looking for articulation in the building, both vertical and horizontal. I think that the 500 Broadway project you showed has some incredible articulation along the sides of it, but the top of the building is still kind of flat, and I think that's done just because it's cheaper to do that way. But I'd love to find some design standards that see some articulation in the parapets. Ground level interface is important, and I think that of the projects you showed, the ones that were really successful had very wide sidewalks in there, and that we make sure that we keep that to mind throughout the entire city. And I know that when you guys did the downtown plan, you were able to put in some wider sidewalks, but when we were going through the first zoning code, or the zoning code update that I was involved with prior to that, it was very hard, it seemed, to get wider sidewalks. So that to me is really important. And then sustainability is important too, but I'm going to take it in a slightly different manner, because I think it's design of the building to consume the least amount of energy. That's where we need to focus a ton of pressure in the beginning to make people think about it early, and make sure that it's parked appropriately based on the location. So that's another aspect of sustainability to me. I'm all for solar panels, but I kind of believe that having denser development in urban centers is as important as making sure that every building is net neutral. And again, I'm going to go back to sustainability consultants always tell me the most important thing is to make sure the building uses the least amount of resources. So I'm not sure you had a ton of overlap in there. Sustainability was definitely discussed, but I'm sorry, Commissioner Raskin has not given us, Vice Chair Raskin has not given us.
Yeah, I'll just be real brief. I think Commissioner Landers really hit the nail on the head with respect to the equity issues here, and I concur wholeheartedly in that. And I'll just add, I think we need to make sure that we're not, endorsing or allowing hostile architecture in any way in our city. And to that point too, I think we need to be able to cultivate designs that integrate into streetscapes that will become more equitable in the future and less car-centric. The only other point I'd add is that I'm of the opinion that we need to allow as much flexibility as possible for cost-effective designs and designs that allow for innovative uses of materials and construction. Standards that will allow for prefabricated materials and perhaps modular designs. Value engineered buildings get criticized all the time, but we're in a housing crisis. We need to make sure that our buildings are going to be able to be delivered in a cost-effective way. So that's all I got. Thank you very much.
That's all extremely helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay. Now, if we could maybe go to one of the next slides where you're asking to get our opinions, and we can go back and give you comments on that.
Share the screen again.
So, do you want to go to Commissioner Reese, do you want to go to the images and we can ask questions about the images, or would you like to go to the question prompts?
I think we should go to the questions.
Okay.
I think we covered the first one in terms of the 5 principles. I think clearly mirrored sustainability. Heard that across the board. That was really important.
Jing, I couldn't really hear you. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just saying that I think what we heard is sustainability was definitely the most important, or one that we heard across the board, in addition to others, in terms of principles.
So I guess if we look at, because I think these very high-level concepts are extremely helpful as we move forward. Are there what we talk about as formal building concepts, things that you look for when you look at buildings that are important to you?
I think that's getting to the second question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm going back to let's look at the. Can you bring the slide back up? I just want to follow the words that are there. Sorry. So I had mentioned, gender-informed design or trauma-informed design. So that's about open space, windows, balconies, lighting, right? And last week, the meeting I missed, but the work that I think Commissioner Fresco represented, looking at, unless it hasn't been presented yet, we've talked about it, is looking at more flexibility on open space, which is something that the working group seems to have focused on as well. So what are the design principles that maximize flexibility with open space, but put constraints on them that are related to, say, safety, open access? Am I framing it in the way that you're looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. So you want to make sure that there's flexibility for design, but standards so that we get a safe space and spaces that are usable.
Right. And if you remember when we had this conversation about R1, we, the commission, tried to flip the script on open space from a prescriptive, you must have this type to open space, to a much more open-ended, you can have whatever you want as long as it doesn't exceed this, right? We were trying to give, and this was in the context of R1 home, buildings, but we basically said, well, let's decide what we don't want and then let people be creative within that space. And I think if you go to the sustainability arguments that the other commissioners were making. If you go to the safety arguments that I'm making, if you go to the materials arguments that Commissioner Raskin's making, we can kind of put up those guardrails and then let people really encourage creativity inside those guardrails.
That makes sense.
Commissioner, any other commission comments on this one? I'm not seeing any, so maybe we should go on to the next question. I mean, I guess I'm just going to make a comment here. When we're talking, I'm all for the flexibility. I think it's important to have flexibility for good design. But I look at some of the things that the ARB had on your slide, and it says, ARB discussed the design is important to be based on the site and the neighborhood. And then scale and proportion seems to equal, well, so on the first note, how do you have objective design that relates to each site? I just don't see how those two work. So how you can have flexible designs for each that work for each design. If you can find that unicorn, we'd love it. But I think that's going to be impossible.
That's the goal. We don't think it's impossible. But that's certainly the goal.
Okay, and then I want you to be careful of, there was another line that said we want to be mindful of scale and proportion. And that sounds like a substitute for compatibility, which we've talked about as being problematic for projects. I understand what you're saying, and that's not what's in our minds. Okay. Well, I'm just saying. Okay. Well, good. I'm glad that's not your mind. Just be careful that somebody else does not interpret it that way.
Right.
That's what I wanted to.
Yeah. So just so that we're clear on, just to explain what we were talking about with scale and proportion, we think we can get that in one is by talking about the window to wall ratio and monumentality of windows. You can have a 2-story building with a monumental window and the building looks gigantic, and you can have a 4-story building with a different window to wall ratio and it doesn't look so big. So that's what we were talking about with scale and proportion.
Okay. Great. All right, let's move to your next slide.
So one of the things that we are focused on is the Bergamot area plan. Had a giant wish list of design guidelines, really, that weren't standards. So they didn't work quite as well as we thought they might. So as we write those standards, what are the aspects that we want to capture? That was the intent of capturing in the Bergamot area plan.
So if anybody's going to disagree. Okay, Commissioner Fonda-Bernardi, go ahead.
Well, one of the things that I think was good about the Bergamot area plan is that pedestrian walkway that's supposed to sort of be a kind of an axis to the whole project, running kind of parallel to the light rail, but block and a half north of it. And the question is, if you wanted a street type design, I think that's the street that we want to have a minimum sidewalk width to make it a really functional pedestrian street. And we can discuss the number, but that would be an area where I think we can really zero in and say, this is what we need for that particular feature of the Bergamot area plan. The other thing that I noticed about the Bergamot area plan, it's the only one in the recent loose document that we were asked to review that actually refers to sustainability. And the question is, why don't the others, ? but also what are the features that are unique to the Bergamot area plan that really speak to sustainability? And those aren't really defined. They're that kind of like, they're kind of aspirational. We hope they get sustainable, but we don't really know what would make it say, yes, this is sustainable enough to get approved. So those are two areas, I think, street sidewalk widths in specific areas and sustainability for the whole area, something that we would definitely want to tie down.
Commissioner Landers.
I mean, I think, you know, and I'm kind of, Chair, kind of jump in here if I'm thinking about what came up in Arrowhead as well. And, you know, when we think about distance from housing to transit, really, there are some realistic limits about how far people will walk before they want to get in their car, right? And much of the Bergamot area is within that that distance. But I think what we would want to look at is what does it mean to think about the 7 minute, like think about a 5 to 7 minute standard between home to metro. Is that or a bus stop? Is that well lit? Is it safe at all hours of the day? Is it a walk street the way Commissioner Fonda Bernardi articulated it? Are we putting in the right balance of ground floor commercial so that there are potentially third space type businesses that are located between the housing, right? So imagine you're on your way to work. Are you going to pick up a coffee on your way to the metro? Are you going to stop for a drink on your way home from the metro, or go to a workout or pick up your laundry? Whatever that is, how are we encouraging that mix, and how are we routing people literally in terms of the street type, the street design, and also the it's maybe a different kind of pedestrian activation than we might see in a much more visitor-oriented a district like downtown. So we're going to have probably fewer hotels here. We're probably going to have fewer visitor destinations. This is going to feel a lot more like you know, kind of an urban, I don't know how else to put it, like an urban suburb, right? And that's sort of what's in my mind.
Commissioner Raskin or Tolkien, do you have any additions to this? Commissioner Tolkien?
I'm wondering about, you know, don't we need some parking in some of these developments? Because not everybody is living close to their work or can jump on the metro and get to work. Is that part of the equation that we're factoring into this? And also guests that come in, they have to have some place to put their cars unless they come in by the train. Am I missing something?
So, I mean, in terms of parking, you know, there is a new state law that actually prohibits the city from imposing minimum parking requirements within a half mile of a major transit stop. It would, you know, cover quite a bit, if not all of the Bergamot area. That being said, no minimum parking requirements doesn't mean zero. You know, doesn't require people to build zero. They can opt to do it, but all it does is it allows the developer to, you know, have the flexibility to build as much parking as, you know, they think they need. We have not had minimum parking requirements in downtown, you know, since the adoption of DCP 2017. I think, you know, with the exception of maybe one or two projects, all of them, you know, include some on-site parking. You know, that's just from the standpoint of ability or marketability, and, you know, what we have seen is applicants will provide parking if that's what they think they need, you know, to make their project successful. So I think that's just the point to clear up. Even though the city can't impose a standard, doesn't mean that people are not building any of it.
Well, Jing, I just wanted to, we have to consider it, because to make a successful project, you may have to provide, even if it's not required.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Jing had said, which is I've worked on a lot of what they refer to in the City of LA as TOC projects, where market rate developers were allowed to provide zero parking. The only one who opted for that was because he owned 6 other buildings within a quarter mile of the site and had a lot of excess parking. So everyone has put parking in because of financing and amenities. So I think it's unlikely we will see none. And if we do, it'll be a few decades off. Commissioner Raskin.
Yeah, I'll just say, y'all have heard me, advocate for more height and more density in Bergamot. I'd love to see us get up to 200-foot height limits there. So whatever standards we do adopt, I hope can incentivize building up, and building more densely.
And I would say that all of my design issues that I talked about prior would apply here. And I will echo what Commissioner Raskin said is if we're putting density, putting it near the transit makes all the sense in the world. All right, I think we've all given your comments on this one. Can we move to the next?
So this one is about the rest of the city and downtown and the commercial districts, and thinking about, what design features are important to residential mixed-use development. And this is just, we've noted here just a few things to sort of, jog your ideas. Is active ground floor important? Is upper building modulation, step backs important, or open space requirements? I think we've heard some discussion around flexibility for open space tonight already, but if you have any additional thoughts, that would be helpful.
Yeah, and to also remind you that particularly in the downtown, but in all of our commercial districts, we already have standards in place in the code for each of these elements. So as you look at the projects or think about the projects that have come before you, what in addition could we potentially provide that would further enhance those elements?
Commissioner Landers.
So here's something we haven't talked about. I'm really interested in the relationship between these design standards. The more you say this now, I'm now finding myself really interested in the relationship between these design standards and incentives and concessions that would be associated with the state density bonus. Because it's all well and good for us to come up with a list of things that we want to require, and then we can see half of them eviscerated by density bonus applicants choosing those as the things they want to ignore. So can you walk us through the relationship between those and give us a sense of what is negotiable and what's not? Because I feel like the more flexibility we offer in the core code, the less there is available for somebody to pull our prescription off the menu and say, no, that's the thing I don't want to do.
Yeah, and I think, we're still, obviously, this creation of objective design standards, we have objective standards in our code now, and, we certainly projects that use state density bonus, concession, incentive, or waiver out of that to the extent, these will be standards. They would be available, for applicants to either incentive, concession, or waiver. But I think that's, part of this is the beginning of the project, right? So, it's a little bit high level today. We're sort of talking about, what the aspirations are, what are the things that, that the commission is interested in. And, we're not quite sure whether we can achieve all of that. I think that is the goal of the project, and, that's what we're going to aspire to do. But I think also importantly, there will be a balancing part of this, when it ultimately comes down to looking at the standards and the flexibility that Stephanie mentioned, that I think we had learned about at a recent conference of like, here's a way you can do it, right? Here is, the standard, and here's, 5 different ways you can achieve it. Like, might that be a way that would, not turn applicants off to like, that standard just doesn't make sense to me. I'm just going to waive out of it and just not do it at all. It's sort of a balance between creating something that is a reasonable, like different pathways to get to something, that still might achieve that outcome. So, it's definitely going to be an iterative process, to understand the push and the pull and sort of, how we can translate, these principles into standards, that are workable and, make it less attractive, I guess, to, an applicant to just feel like, well, that's just, I'm just going to kind of, session or a waiver. And, of course they have to document that request, and it has to be, in as required by state law, of course. But, that's I think some of the work to come. That answer your question?
It's helpful. I mean, I feel like, one of the things that, so there's the open space conversation. We've had it over and over again, and we're going to have it again in the red lines. And, Leslie and Nina and I worked on this a bit inside our Brown Act group. And so we'll, she shared some of that, I'm sure, and we'll keep going with that. But for instance, on the active ground floor requirements, which is something else we talked about in terms of moving away from requirement of a stoop or a separate entrance everywhere, we also don't want to end up in a situation that I heard about this weekend, which is there are a lot of empty ground floor retail, beautiful ground floor retail spaces in San Francisco that are super empty because their standards required, let's call it a hyperactive ground floor, and it ended up kind of displacing longstanding businesses, but then nobody could afford to pay the rents required to come in, and it wasn't worth lowering the rents for the developers who end up with a lot of empty ground floor space. So I would want to be, to your point there, I would then, it's a kind of an example where I'd like to kind of provide that flexibility up front on the ground floor so that they don't waive out on something that we know is going to end up really harming our local commercial, particularly outside the downtown, but also inside the downtown, and try to maximize that flexibility there. I thought staff had done some really good ground laying work on this in the housing element red lines, but as a design principle as well, our design principle should be advocated. Our design principle should be aiming for healthy commercial, city serving, neighborhood serving commercial. And if we over prescribe on the ground floor, we're going to end up with a lot of empty spaces and a lot of temporary pop-ups.
Yeah, that makes sense, Commissioner Landris. In my view, I think we so far have a good combination of standards for the commercial ground floor. I think what we might be focusing on the ground floor will be standards for residential ground floor. If and when we introduce residential, say, along our commercial boulevards. And so we know that there is a balance always of activity and quietness. And we also understand that there has to be a certain level of flexibility. I was on a panel for the APA conference, and the person from HCD, who will be our contact person, said that one of the cities submitted objective design standards that had 200 standards. And it was very clear that the city was using their objective design standards to prevent development. Like, that's not what we're doing here. So, we do want to say, wanted to also bring up the wedding cake downtown. Like, sometimes you do something and you think it works, and then, it really doesn't work so well, and you have to change course. So we anticipate, since we have a lot of great people working on it, we have a great team, we have a really good ARB subcommittee that will get involved as soon as we have some shape to this. We think we will get most of it right at the very beginning, but some of it will have to be retooled.
And if I can just follow up, last question on this because you raised it. Has the city determined whether AB 211 will apply to our commercial corridors? I know that the city council early on in our housing element process added housing as a fully permitted use everywhere except industrial, conservation, I guess, and healthcare district. So it's not clear to me whether 2011 will trigger in Santa Monica. Have you made a determination about this? Because that, if it does, there are some development standards and design standards in AB 2011 that would apply.
Yeah. So I think, as you know, it's a very dense and complex law. That we're still trying to absorb and work through. So I think we're certainly looking at that. I appreciate you raising the point, and we will take a look at it.
Thank you.
Okay. I want to. Okay, Commissioner Kafana-Bernardi, go right ahead.
I'd like to rewind a second to something Commissioner Landers raised, which is if we live in a universe where when you reach a certain standard, you can ask for concessions on up to 3 or however many they allow you. And that becomes kind of the norm where everybody says, well, I'll go there and then I'll get those 3 concessions. When they reach for those 3 concessions, is there anything that can't be conceded? In other words, is there anything that is off the table and sacred in the city of Santa Monica that you can't ask for as a concession? You can ask for these things, but not those other things. And can you explain, is there a bright line there or not?
Sure, I'll hop in. So the law provides what the definition of an actual incentive or concession is, which is actually fairly broad. It's modification of requirements, of zoning code requirements. It's regulatory incentives or concessions. So it's fairly broad. The city does have an opportunity to deny a request for an incentive or concession under state density bonus law under some limited circumstances. If the city does do that, the burden is on the city to demonstrate that that it was, properly denied. And so the state really does kind of favor granting these incentives or concessions. And I'm pulling up the language for you now. One potential ground to deny an incentive or concession is that it's inconsistent with state or federal law. One is that based on, evidence in the record, it wouldn't actually result in cost reductions. And court cases have really favored developers in those situations, and any sort of documentation that they provide. It's very difficult for the city to sort of rebut. So that's more or less, or if it would have an a specific adverse impact on public health or safety. And that bar is actually, the legislature has made clear that bar is actually very high as well.
Essentially, everything we can put in, someone can take out, is what we're really saying. So I don't think that necessarily changes what we put in, but we can't rely on what we put in to do the job. It's gonna be a very, very, very weak. It's even below a guideline. It's a dream. It's a wishful thinking kind of thing, which we're going to engage in. And nothing wrong with dreaming, but we can't rely on these things to do the job. So I don't know if that changes what we put into our mix, or we just say, well, you're on your own. Good luck. Here's your height limit, or here's your floor area ratio, and that's it. That's all that works. Everything else is sort of pretend.
Even those can be adjusted, Mario.
I know. That's the point I'm making. That those sound like really hard. Let's call them objective design standards, and they're the first to go. And so, how do you expect the other ones like modulation to survive, or how do you expect open space to survive?
They have a limited number they should
Yeah,
ask for.
yeah. If I may, I wanted to point out that there is a limited number, and typically, what we've seen developers ask for are modifications to height, and setback requirements. And if we've got, we anticipate having more than 5, but less than 200 design standards. So we don't think that, we do think that these, once we develop objective design standards, and if and when we do have to cease our discretionary review process, we do believe that they will make a difference in the quality of design that we get in the city.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and you mentioned something about the wedding cake earlier. And, the wedding cake's not a bad idea. I like that you showed the Jantz Court, and I think that's a successful project from the standpoint of a design standpoint. I do believe, just as a side note, that applicant went bankrupt. I'm not sure how you define, we have to be careful how we define successful. But anyways, I still like the concept.
The operation was a success, but the patient died.
Right. I like the wedding cake, but at the same point, I don't want to see a wedding cake up and down the street. So what I would urge you to consider is something they do in the SNAP. It's a station area plan for the city of LA, where when you apply the wedding cake, you can figure out what the cubic volume is of the building you're removing. And then the architect has the ability to remove the same cubic volume in a different configuration. That way we get a very, there's a chance for a variation and a unique design.
If I may, Commissioner Reese, is the difference we've imposed on the DCP, where we ask for an area, a volume of modulation, and allow architects to place it where they want on the building frontage?
I mean, that's what I'm basically implying, is that maybe use the wedding cake as your base standard, which creates that cubic volume loss. And if somebody wants to just follow the code, they go do that. But if they want to be creative, they figure out what that volume loss is, and then they apply it some other way.
I see. Because what we've done with the DCP is just go to here's the volume we want to modulate, and then you can do that the way you want.
Stephanie, that just shows my lack of understanding of that plan. So if you already have it in there.
Well, I'm glad that you've got to explain it, because we think it's a great success.
Yeah, I think it's similar, because it's like a percentage requirement with some depth and height. So it's a similar one, but we'll definitely take a look at. Yeah.
Okay.
Look at that.
Great. So now Commissioner Raskin, and then Commissioner Fonbonardi.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit last week, but we've heard from a variety of folks, and I've heard personally from a variety of folks who have said that active ground floor requirements can sometimes be a barrier to building housing on the ground floor. And so to the extent that active ground floor requirements make it more difficult to build housing, I would not be in favor of that. And I think that, to the extent that any of these requirements would make life more difficult for those who are building 100% affordable housing projects in the city, I'd be in favor of more flexibility there. That's a comment that applies globally for all these things. But, I imagine we'll be talking more about ground floor development standards more in the future. So I suppose we'll keep that conversation going.
So to clarify, Commissioner Raskin, what we would consider design standards, but also use standards. So it's the active use. In some places, move that active use. So I think that those are combined standards that we'll need to, if we want to encourage housing on the ground floor. And then once we do that, how do you maintain an active street frontage?
Great. Any other comments on this one? Any other questions from staff, from us on this one? Commissioner Landers? And then, wait, hold on, sorry, Commissioner Landers. Commissioner Bernardi, did you have something after Commissioner Landers? I thought maybe you did.
Well, it was actually the example that was shown of the modulation of the code that we have. You have to realize that's very slight modulation. That doesn't create the nice volumes that you might want to have. It's a very modest standard. It's not very muscular. Nothing wrong with it, but I'm saying it's not the standard that you were proposing, Commissioner Reese, which says you start with this subtraction, but you can place the subtraction wherever you want. I think that leads to more muscular buildings. It leads more drama. The other one is sort of playing with the facade a little bit.
Okay. Well, that's a good clarification. So staff, I would just have you look at that and let's see how we can, let's make sure that we're getting, good modulation as opposed to okay modulation. And Commissioner Landers, you're next.
So, yeah, I mean, so this kind of is about this is sort of a modulation question. It's also, I feel like we're going back over the greatest hits of our discretionary reviews of the last few years and where we felt frustration. And also this question of like what on menu incentives and where can we, obviously they can ask for anything, but if we point them to something, maybe we can point them and make it easy for them to just say, oh yeah, I'll take that one because it's something we actually want. And I'm wondering, Mario, help me with this. When we were looking at the project next to Shutters, we were frustrated because we wanted to do more of a, we wanted to soften the facade on the Vicente Terrace side. And one of the things that we had talked about, which was not permitted under the code, was literally moving FAR from one side of the project to the other. And this was a function of where the ground level was based on the corner and which was the main frontage of the building. And therefore we got ground level X and the slope, was kicking us all in the pants. I'm wondering, in this context, is there a design flexibility that we could offer that would involve internal FAR, like on a larger lot, being able to move that FAR around and maybe go higher but narrower in exchange for, when we're bumping up against maybe when we're stepping down a zoning district or something like that. You see where I'm going. You remember the project well, I know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That in a way, what you're asking is if we have on a larger site an idea for a kind of transfer development rights within a particular project to transfer height and density. That's an interesting idea. I don't think that we've considered that.
I wasn't part of that project. Can you explain, Sean or staff, what do you mean by moving? Why wouldn't you be able to move FAR and density around?
Well, because we wanted to. The short version is that there was height on all four sides of the project, but Pico was not considered the main. The project was considered to be on Ocean rather than Pico, which subjected it to Ocean. And stop me if I'm getting this wrong. Ocean Avenue standards. And what we had kind of all said was, well, why couldn't we move the height over to Pico? Because at that part of Pico, it wasn't going to be looming over anything the way that it was going to be looming over Vicente Terrace, which is right. And we couldn't because they were already at their height maximum for Pico Boulevard or Ocean Avenue. Sorry, Mario, am I getting that right?
Yeah, it actually started because the lot it wasn't in the right direction, and it was long and thin in the wrong direction. So what it did, it moved the main street over from Ocean Avenue to Pico, and that created setback issues, which then shaped the building in a certain way that was disadvantageous to the neighbors, the Vicente Terrace, which is very low rise, 1 or 2 stories. But our compromise was worked out. That worked for everybody. It just took some muscle, and we had a developer that was willing to go with it.
Right. But in this instance, that would, if we could have baked that compromise, or we could have baked some additional flexibility into our downtown or our burn code, where on a larger lot you could simply shift that density, that height or density, over to a different part of the parcel. That also would get you some modulation and give you some design creativity. And it'll all be shorter than the 15-foot build as remedy project, right? So
15-story.
Yeah, we wish it was 15 foot. Those would be really small units.
micro units, nano units.
Okay. Any other comments on this one? Let's move on, staff.
I think that that was actually the last of the sort of guided questions we have. So we're sort of into the, any closing thoughts the commission has. If there's, as you saw some of the examples, and, as Michelle Landers was saying, sort of a walk down memory lane into the commission's greatest hits of your prior reviews and things that were successful and maybe not so successful, that might be just maybe a helpful way to close out the discussion here.
Commissioner Fonda-Bernardi.
Well, a couple of things. One is, you saw from those examples, that was our existing code with all of its limitations, supposedly, creating actually very good projects, that people were able to do very good projects. So we're not talking here about a radical change. I don't think a radical change is required. I think that sophisticated designers can work within the current situation, the current objective standards, however you define those, regarding open space, active uses, and there's going to be minor tweaks that might be beneficial, but we're not blowing up the zoning code. I don't think that's the road we want to go. That's the first thing I'd like to say. And then the other thing is that, as I understand it, these changes that we're making, are they envisioned as being global, that is, for every project, for the new Target or for the new bowling alley that's coming, or are they limited just to housing? Are these concessions, these options, these guidelines limited to a very select number of projects? Maybe that's something that Stephanie, you could answer.
Yeah, so to clarify, the objective design standards would be adopted if and when the HCD decided that we needed to comply with SB 35 and could no longer have design.
We lost just.
Maybe I can clarify, actually. So we actually do have a housing element program that speaks to the development of these standards, because it may not just be SB 35 in the future. That is the direction that a lot of housing legislation is moving towards, and so we don't want to be caught flat-footed, if the city finds itself in that situation. I think that being said, Commissioner Fonda-Bernardi, do these apply just to housing projects or other projects? I think that's truly going to be a policy question. When we develop this, right now we're thinking about this really in the context of housing projects, because that's sort of in the must-do category, if you will. But I think if once we develop them, we find that it is advantageous, also apply it to non-housing projects, and keeping in mind, as we discussed last week, our definition of housing projects and non-housing projects, right? The difference is like 33% versus something else. So 33% non-residential, in a project versus something that might be higher than that. There could be projects like that you may want to impose these sorts of standards. But that will be a policy question that I think we can tackle in future discussions about this.
Okay.
Any other comments, commissioners? So thank you, staff, for that presentation.
Thank you all for your feedback. This is really helpful.
Yeah, and it's an important job you guys are trying to do, because this will help craft what we look like over the next 50 years.
And once we have developed the unicorn, we'll share it with everyone.
Fantastic. Okay, let me get back to my agenda. Yes.
Chair, a question, and I'm not volunteering for this because I don't have the expertise, but I heard staff say that there's an ARB subcommittee working on this. Would it be to the Planning Commission's benefit to, delegate one of our members who has architectural expertise to pursue this offline with staff?
Well, I think that would be beneficial if one of the architects was interested in doing that.
I'd be willing to do that.
I think that'd be great.
Okay.
So can we put on our next meeting agenda a discussion and approval of an ad hoc subcommittee on objective design standards?
Yeah, we'll do.
Thanks.
By all means, leave it to the designers. You do not want me making design standards. Okay, so we're closing out of 3A. We're gonna move to 3B, and this is a study session for Planning Commission review, discussion on the Accessory Dwelling Unit Handbook, project supported and funded from the Southern California Association of Governments. Staff, if we could get a presentation.
Hi, Commission. So yes, as you mentioned, the next item on the agenda is the study session for the review and discussion for the ADU handbook that staff with our consultants at AECOM have been working on for a little over a year now. But to take a quick step back before we start the presentation, as you may recall, there are a handful of programs within the housing element that deal with the production of ADUs throughout the city. Specifically, Program 1G is to incentivize and facilitate the construction of ADUs through an ADU Accelerator Program. And what this Accelerator Program entails is the development of a user-friendly ADU handbook that really demystifies and brings greater transparency to all things ADU. So anything from development standards to process to construction costs. And we're not just talking about in the topics of city planning, but any department that might touch ADUs throughout the process. So building and safety, public works, fire, they are all being folded into this user-friendly handbook that ultimately the goal is that a average resident could read this handbook and could come away with it with a better understanding of what they are about to embark on. So it's going to take anyone through the process of a conceptual plan to how to be a landlord after construction is finalized. And so to help us with this work product, as you may recall in past presentations, staff alerted the Commission that we had applied and received a grant from SCAG using REAP funds to produce this handbook. So with our consultants, AECOM, that is what we've been largely doing over this last year. And the presentation that we're about to get into, which will largely be led by our consultants, will be an overview of everything up to this point that has happened. So all of our technical analysis, all of our public outreach, and it's really going to be a formal introduction to the Commission on what this work product has been. And it will ultimately be the unveiling of this this draft of the user-friendly handbook to hopefully receive comments and recommendations from the Commission that we can fold in to the handbook as we now move into the kind of finalization stage of this grant. So with that little background, I'm going to now hand it over to Susan with AECOM to lead this presentation.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Just give me one moment.
Welcome to our Commission.
Thank you. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, we can.
You can. Okay, perfect. Thanks. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so So in the presentation tonight, we'll just give you an overview of the project, the outreach, the technical work that we've done, how it's resulted in some new planning tools, and the next steps, and then we'll open it up for introductions. So as Ross mentioned, this is funded by SCAG. We worked also with the City of Pasadena and Laguna Beach, and we are also supported by a sub called RNLA, Restore Neighborhoods Los Angeles, and they are an ADU builder. So they have a lot of great on-the-ground experience to bring to the table and help integrate this handbook. So in terms of the overview and timeline, this was REAP funded. The intent was to improve housing production in response to the housing crisis. So the project goals were to assess and modernize the city's ADU permitting processes and policies and to develop the handbook that Ross was mentioning. So we kicked off about a year ago in fall 2021, where we started with the technical work. Then we went out and did some surveys in the spring of 2022, which was really interesting feedback that we were able to incorporate into the project. In the summer of 2022, we had some public meetings, and now we're here in the fall of 2022 preparing and presenting these final project deliverables. So there's several deliverables for the project. We had both which were submitted to the city, as well as ADU tools that were designed for the community. And I'll go into detail on each one of these in a moment. So, but before we get into the actual tools, wanted to touch on outreach. So we had 2 public workshops. The first workshop was held back in May. The purpose of this one was really to introduce the public to the project, talk to them about why the project is important, what the state and local goals for the project were, a brief on ADU state law and city regulations, and to present some initial findings and recommendations from the technical work and also hear back from the community. Then we held a second workshop on October 6th, and that was to share the handbook with the public for the first time and get their feedback on the draft materials. So in terms of what was reviewed at the first public workshop, we had what was called a needs assessment report, which I'll get into in a moment. We shared our surveys and our survey results, and then we talked about some general opportunities and constraints that we identified in our initial assessment. And then, as I mentioned in workshop number 2, there are several community tools that had been developed, and so we reviewed those with the public, which included the handbook, some prototype design options, a checklist that we've created, a revised ADU permit application, and a cost estimator, which is still in development, so we didn't share a final product, but we shared what the intent was and let people know that it was coming online soon. In terms of what we heard, we had great attendance at the first workshop, had a really interesting discussion. There were questions related to health and safety, how ADUs affected property taxes, specific permitting and process regulation questions. There was an interest in reducing permitting fees, resources to connect with contractors and designers. So we did include this section in the handbook, access to resources and tools from the project. So obviously these tools are to be posted on the city's website, and then pre-approved ADU designs that the city might consider in the future. This particular project did not tackle a pre-approved ADU design program for the city. There's a couple different models in which cities are starting to do this, but within the time frame and budget for this particular project wasn't something that we could take on, but instead we did develop conceptual plans, which I will share with you tonight, which should tee up the city quite well for looking into a program like that in the future. And then we also heard about ADU funding availability questions and some financial assistance programs that folks might be eligible for. And then in the second workshop, we really focused on the permitting process. There were a lot of questions about that. We shared some of the tools and resources from the project that were in draft form. We shared the pre-approved, the conceptual plans for the different prototypes that were developed for the most popular ADU types within the city. And then we talked about improvements to the ADU application process. So Ross, if you want to talk about neighborhood meetings for a moment.
Yes, so on top of the two workshops, staff reached out to the various neighborhood associations to kind of give additional outreach opportunity, especially to the neighborhoods that are being impacted or that we're seeing ADU development the most in, so typically our single-family neighborhoods. So although we reached out to all those neighborhood groups, only two took us up on that offer. So you can see those were the North of Montana Association and the Friends of Sunset Park. A lot of the takeaway from those neighborhood meetings where I kind of explained the work products, what the handbook was forming into. A lot of the questions, though, were just regarding just general ADU regulations and standards, which they weren't necessarily comments regarding the handbook, but nonetheless, you know, as we received kind of repeat questions maybe about the same standard, that was kind of a signal to us that more light needed to be shined on certain topics. So they still helped us inform some of the revisions we made throughout the handbook. On top of the general questions, we did hear some concerns of the overdevelopment of the R1 and the kind of the pros and cons that ADUs might have on existing character. There were questions about the connection between SB9 and ADUs. And lastly, there was a suggestion or a request that the ADU, the city provide a mapping tool for the ADU developments throughout the city, which I do want to share with you that we are now going to be adding an ADU tab, if you will, to the upcoming housing dashboard. So individuals can see how many permits have been issued per year and where their general location are within the cities. So largely from these neighborhood meetings, we heard similar comment that we did in the workshop number 2, but nonetheless, staff wanted to give additional opportunities and kind of that more personal touch to our neighborhoods that are most impacted by ADUs.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now shifting to the technical work. So as you can see here, there are about 6 different deliverables that were submitted to the city. The first was a needs assessment report. So that was really trying to get a handle on the city's experience to date with ADUs, to outline best practices, summarize the ADU applications, permits, and completions, so we could just get a handle on the quantitative data that would be helpful in informing the process, and looking at different staffing needs and how that might be influencing the process for folks trying to build ADUs. And then we looked at providing recommendations for streamlining the permit process and updating policies to comply with state ADU law. So it's a great first step in really understanding what some of the issues were in Santa Monica. Then we did a survey. We ended up deciding to break it out into 2 different surveys. Santa Monica had great interest and response rates, which was fantastic. A really great pool of data to be able to use moving forward. So we did what we called an interest survey. So those were folks who had never built an ADU before. So they were interested in it. And we got 285 responses for this. We really wanted to gauge the public's interest in ADU development and find out maybe what key barriers were, the types of ADUs, why they were interested in building an ADU. So what we found out was a perceived concern about the process and just lack of understanding of the process was the highest barrier that was listed. Although that said, people were very interested in ADU development despite some of the perceived barriers. And generally, people were interested in housing a family member or an acquaintance or for supplemental rental income. Then we had our experience survey, also got some great numbers and responses. So these are folks that had developed an ADU, so maybe they were an architect or a property owner, for example. And so nearly 40% had started but not yet completed an ADU project. So if you hadn't yet completed the project, you were still considered in this pool of data. In general, we found out that there were some issues with the process. The process took longer than people anticipated, both in terms of entitlement and then on the construction side. But even with some bad experiences with the process, most people said they would recommend building an ADU to a friend, which was good news. So we did a spatial analysis and try to understand if there are any spatially related constraints or correlations between ADUs and where they were being built. So we looked at demographics, zoning, lot width, buildable area, for example, slopes, hazards. And it was really interesting to see. So this map on the right shows where ADU permits have been issued. So you can see that there are some hot spots on both the west and east side of the city. There was a correlation with median income. So more ADUs have been built in properties where the median income is on the high side, and some were built in on properties where the median income was on the lower side. So it's interesting to see some of those correlations. So the constraints assessment, or opportunities and constraints assessment, looked at these spatial factors in addition to a number of other factors to try to really understand if there were particular, barriers related to the zoning code, for example, which in Santa Monica's case was not an issue. So we also took a look at legalization issues, which is an issue across several cities, trying to understand the extent of ADU legalizations, looking at case studies from other jurisdictions where they have tried to expedite legalization of previously built ADUs, to educate people about why it's helpful potentially to legalize your ADU, what some of the benefits are, and there's different best practices for doing so. So those are summarized in this report. We also looked at potential financial assistance programs, looking at loan and grant programs, educational programs, tenant matchmaking, for example. So there are a number of different programs out there, and so hopefully they'll become a good source of potential options for the city moving forward. We also looked at monitoring and assessment. So really assessing the city's existing monitoring process and looking at some of the best practices, for example, in the city of Los Angeles, where they have an interactive quarterly housing report. And as Ross mentioned, it is being updated on the city's dashboard, which is great. So that stemmed from some of the research there. So moving on to the planning tools, these were really geared towards the general public and trying to help them have the tools they need to build an ADU on their property. So the primary major deliverable really was the handbook, because a lot of the research that we did in other areas were ultimately packaged into this handbook. So it's intended to be a guide on what you need to know about building an ADU on your property. So it's the rules governing ADUs, how to evaluate your property for what type of ADU might work for you, looking at the different types of ADUs, the potential costs, and providing some steps for design, permitting, and construction, so people know what to anticipate when they venture down that path. And there's also an FAQ section and links to resources. So here's an example of the table of contents in the process overview section I was referring to. So you can see the diagrams on the right, help you understand what type of ADU might work for you based on your lot. And we have some conceptual designs as well. And we'd love to hear your feedback. So this document is not finished. It's not finalized. We're happy to integrate comments that the commission has or that the general public has. So we welcome your feedback. So we also created some prototype design options. And this was really to help people get a basic understanding of what type of ADU might work on their lot, what are some design options. If they're thinking about, I want something that's 2-bedroom, what kind of footprint might that have? Where might I put it? What are some of the basic zoning standards that I need to keep in mind? And so here's some samples from the prototype design. So we created 5. The 5 chosen were the 5 most popular types of ADUs that we saw built in Santa Monica, because we obviously wanted to pick prototypes that would be most beneficial to the most number of potential ADU builders. So we created these different types. The one shown on the right is a sample of E, which is the 2-story, 2-bedroom, 2.5 bath sample. So you can see the additional ADU in the back of the lot there. So we created some basic floor plans to give people a sense of what might work for them. So obviously it's not meant to double as stamped approved ADU plans that you could bring into the city, but certainly a good starting place for a conversation with an architect. So we also created a new ADU permit application. This was based on some good discussions with building and safety and planning staff on how to simplify and just make the application more straightforward and understandable. And so we have a draft of this as well. We also created a checklist process diagram. So again, working with planning and building and safety to understand the different steps involved and to lay it out in a graphically simple way, really to act as that checklist for property owners working their way through the process. So we really tried to keep it as straightforward and simple, but thorough at the same time. So people didn't have any surprises in the process. And so finally, we have this cost estimator tool. So it's still in development, but the idea is that someone could go online and input different aspects of the ADU that they're looking to build, and they could get a sense of what some of the project design, permit construction, and utility connection costs might be, and that helps them sort of play around with some potential cost reduction methods. So this would be integrated into the Santa Monica City website, or I should say probably linked out from, but available through the website. And just to mention, the fees are just to help folks as a feasibility assessment. The actual fees, for example, would be determined when they would submit. So it's really just meant to be a helpful guide, but obviously not the exact fees that they would necessarily pay. So in terms of next steps for the project, so December 7th, a final package will be presented to the Planning Commission, and then a final package would be completed and submitted to the city as well by the end of the year. So the project will wrap up in a couple months, but there's still definitely opportunity to get input on the handbook and other final deliverables. So for anyone from the public who's listening in, here are some quick links on ADU, to get the ADU info on the project and to provide feedback on the deliverables presented. So we'd love to hear from you, and I can share this again in a moment. So now I've tried to move pretty quickly in the interest of time, because I know you had a robust discussion on ODS, but we'd love to hear from you. So now we'd like to switch into discussion and question period. So I'll stop sharing my slide deck for now, but I'm happy to pull up any of these slides that you might have questions on. Okay.
I was muted. I was suggesting that you put up that one slide that says how to connect with you while we're asking our first set of questions.
Sounds good. I'll go share my screen again.
Okay, okay. So I saw the first hand go up with Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Yeah, I have a number of questions. First of all, thank you for such an excellent report. I was very impressed by the way each condition was laid out in terms of what would constrain it, setbacks, heights, under different conditions in single-family zones and multifamily zones. It was very clear, very well done. Whoever worked on that really deserves a raise because it's hard to skin the cat that way and get it to work in all situations. The question I had was, did you do the same service for the 3 cities that were participating or just for Santa Monica?
I had muted myself and I'm on a single screen right now. So let me just share the PowerPoint again for folks. But yeah, so we did this for the city of Pasadena and the city of Laguna Beach.
Meaning you prepared a book, you did all those surveys?
We did, yes.
And were there any substantive differences in how people responded to these different questions in different cities?
Yeah, an interesting question. So, well, specifically with the survey, kudos to Santa Monica because you had the most number of respondents by far. So that was really great because I think you have just a bigger pool of information, based on people's feedback. I think in all three cases, and Ross alluded to this, when we would hold meetings, we got a lot of people who had built an ADU and maybe had a difficult time. And so they used that opportunity to, sort of share or ask questions about their experience. That happened in all three cities uniformly. So I think that really tells us that people are struggling to build ADUs in many cities, and many cities, are in the process of updating their ADU ordinance or just did. And, the confusing sort of difference between the state and maybe local regulations and trying to get through that process. I think there were common issues across where to go in terms of, is there an ADU specific building and safety or planning rep that really knows how to answer all of the ADU questions? I think that came up in all three cities. In terms of parallels in the spatial analyses, definitely median income correlation came up in all three cities. Laguna Beach had substantially less ADU development. They have a lot more topography issues. So the spatial analysis there was quite different than Santa Monica. So I would say Santa Monica probably had more in common with Pasadena.
Okay. So you then made specific recommendations for our city in terms of things that they could do. And I wanted to step through those, and maybe Ross can answer those. One of the recommendations was that a designated person and or team work just on ADUs. Given the workload in our city, is there enough work in ADUs for 1 or 3 or 5 people to work on just ADUs or not? And maybe there's something that you could respond to in that regard.
I'll maybe hand it to the city to respond to that specifically.
Sure. So I would say ADUs is one of the hottest topics in Santa Monica at the moment, whether that be just general inquiry or even building permits. So it is, I do feel like there's quite a lot of work that, is devoted to, the establishment of ADUs. As far as, staffing, if we can actually, single out someone that can only work on that, I don't know if I can answer that question. But ADUs are very popular, as you kind of also heard throughout the housing element, for some of those graphs that you saw in this presentation, especially since 2020, those new state laws. I feel like, when the state removed even further barriers to ADU production, we've only seen increases every year. I think in 2021, we had a little over 100 permits issued for just ADUs. Some of those conversions, some of those just ADUs, some of those may be also tied to a completely new development as well. And we also are starting to see more and more interest of ADUs within our multifamily. So I imagine as that starts kicking off, I don't see an end in sight with ADUs at the moment.
Okay. Well, one of the recommendations from your consultant was that you commit to a response time. And given that we've already got 4,500 units in the pipeline, more on the way, can you do that? Can you commit to a specific? And the reason I ask is that, I'll be quite honest, the response time in our city is terrible. It takes 3 months to get a response on a bedroom addition. And I'm not exaggerating. Those are my personal experiences. So what are we saying about ADUs that's going to help us get to a better response time?
So within state law, there are already kind of time limits of the city has 60 days to approve an ADU's building permit, at least as far as like the development standards as planning is concerned. It is told when sometimes it needs to then be kicked back to the applicant to make revisions, but ultimately we are striving to hit that 60-day kind of a cumulative time period. And, I will say, I think.
Is that just for the planning approval, not the building department? Is that what you're saying?
So it's we've taken the stance, and Jane can maybe weigh in on this, that we're not going to approve an ADU permit that doesn't meet building code, but I think the planning kind of aspects to, the setbacks and the height, kind of the more development standard aspects that planning reviews, we are striving to get reviewed within those 60 days. And I do want to mention that, I think we're aware that, the process takes a long time, and we're hoping that, though, this handbook will help with that, because I think sometimes individuals are not aware that they needed a soils report or another requirement that then adds time kind of already in the middle of the process. So if the goal is to front load all of this information, and hopefully that will result in a quicker processing time, hopefully.
Okay. And then one of the other questions is, and I don't know if this is the area for this, but legalizing ADUs, or what will be ADUs that are illegal today because they were bootlegged in or done without a permit. I don't know if we're talking about that now, but do we have a process for that? Does our city have a process to do that?
So when we did research in, has this come up a lot? We found very few. I mean, I think maybe just one or two that were actual illegal structures from the first place. A lot of what we've dealt with, or we see, is maybe someone has converted an existing legal structure to an ADU without the permits, but the structure itself was legal to begin with. And ultimately, the process really is, you just need to apply for a building permit to essentially do that conversion legally. And, with state law, you get to keep that existing footprint. You can keep the size. It's really just making sure that it's brought up to habitable building code requirements. But, we do see that kind of illegal conversion far more often than the structure itself being illegal. And I think it's a fairly straightforward process of just apply for a building permit, and let's make sure that your electrical and plumbing and, everything is up to, snuff. So it's more of the building code technical work on that.
Is that suggestion baked into your handbook? Because I think there are more bootleg units, not new construction bootleg units, where people have taken garages or the backs of another building or something and added a unit back there by sliding a little kitchenette in the bathroom, and then that's a unit. But we want all those units to come out of the cold. We want to almost flush them out, make it easy to legalize them so we're not driving up the homelessness, but we want them legalized because of safety issues.
Mm-hmm. So I think because we don't currently have a process, like how to legalize, let's say, the existing illegal structure, it's not in the handbook currently. The kind of process I just talked about, I think, is walked through in the handbook. But I think if there was a program or process that is developed to address those other units, then it would at a later date be kind of folded into the handbook once there is a more fleshed out way we will be handling those. But right now we don't have that.
I would like to see it added to the handbook as part of a full package handbook that covers all the contingencies, everything you need to know, whether you're legal or illegal or somewhere in between. There has to be a way for those units to be brought in and get their heating, get the right size door, get the smoke alarm, get all the stuff they probably don't have, but they should have. And last question I had is, and maybe this is a broader planning question, in all the literature that we're seeing, the rear yard and side yard setback for the ADUs are 4 feet. When there's an alley behind your project, and often there is, do you measure the 4 feet from the property line or the center line of the alley? Meaning you can't get into the alley, of course, but can you put your building, your ADU, right up to what is the de facto property line?
We've been for the ADUs, we've been using the actual property line. So we have not been taking it from center line of the alley like we do with other rear yard setbacks we have. For ADUs, it's been 4 feet from actual property line.
Okay.
Or at least new construction.
That's all.
Existing ones can also be converted to exactly where they are. But yeah.
Right.
Commissioner Tolkien, you're next.
Chair, Before we continue with questions, we're just realizing we actually didn't open public comment for the prior item, and maybe this would be an opportunity just to take public comment. See if anyone's calling in on the line just for a minute for both items at the same time, since they're both discussion items.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I once again apologize that I omitted that in our agenda. But let's go ahead and do that.
Julie, would you mind putting the slide on the screen and we can do the 1 minute countdown? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We're having a moment of silence.
We did not receive any calls in that time.
Is it too late to make some comments?
Not for us. We're just trying to allow the public to call in.
Okay.
Well, hold on just a second, Commissioner Tolkien. What I do want to say is if anybody in the public wants to call in at this point, I think they still can call in, and staff can let us know that they've called in. Correct, staff?
That's correct.
Okay. So it would be great if we left the call-in number up there just a little bit longer. And at this point, I'd ask Commissioner Tolkien to give us his comments, please.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I thought staff did a beautiful job on this ADU report and the handbook and all the tools. The other thing I wanted to ask, if anybody considered prefabricated ADUs, which are on the rise, and what that might look like in terms of permitting, et cetera.
In Santa Monica, we haven't seen a lot of prefab ADUs, at least thus far, but I am aware that that's starting to become a far more popular option in other cities and might make its way over to Santa Monica as well. Susan, I don't know if we have, as far as prefab, as far as the siting on the property, the standards will still, be largely the same if you were building it, from scratch, if you will. But I don't believe, and Susan, you can maybe correct me, do we have any information in the handbook more specific to prefab ADUs, or it's probably still largely the same process?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We did not treat them separately, and so the handbook is written sort of agnostic to whether it's prefab or traditional construction typology. But it's something we could consider in terms of just noting that it is an option that's becoming more popular, and potentially include some resources as well. Sometimes those things get dated, and so in the handbook there's only so many opportunities to get in there and update it. So we were trying to be sensitive to not needing to have it be constantly in flux, but I think if we can find a good balance of including some information in there that we know won't be dated in 3 months in terms of resources, for example, I think that sounds great.
That was my only question.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Landris, you're next.
Yeah, Commissioner Tolkien and I are on the same page on this. I want to actually ask that in a little bit more of a pointed way. One of the things that prefab companies do is advertise accelerated permitting processes, pre-approved designs. They also, you broke down first of all, this is all in the context of this is a great report. I'm just sort of thinking about user friendliness and overcoming barriers and lightening the burden on staff. So so those companies, if you go to their websites, frequently they will show you models in, the 0, 1, 2 formats, right? And those roughly, but don't exactly correspond to the square footage examples that you've given us in the Santa Monica version of the report. The suggestion that, the question and suggestions that I would make would be, can we be identifying standards for pre-approval so that, you could have a section that says prefab or custom build ? And explains in the Santa Monica context the advantages and disadvantages of both, and tells people that if they go the prefab route, and this presumably could be updated as we go, here are the accelerated processing times, here are the reduced fees, here is a current and accurate list of the companies that have pre-approved plans registered with the city. Anybody who else is telling you that they do is lying, kind of thing, because there are a lot of companies out there who claim to do all this. So I actually think it would accelerate ADU uptake if we could actually show people what that looks like and explain to them the pros and cons. And I would argue on a policy basis that we should be accelerating the approval time and reducing fees for anybody who goes with a prefab that has, met the city's standards and has established, that their plans do meet Santa Monica specific code. So that's one set of kind of questions and recommendations. The other piece is, I do think it would be good to lean in on, and this is again getting into policy, lean in on sustainability and equity, right? So I think we've talked about this before. I'm not the only person on the commission who thinks it would be a great idea to have some sort of incentive to create affordable, deed restricted ADUs in exchange for some city financing. That's a much longer policy and budgetary conversation. But I think we ought to, in the handbook, express the city's view, which is that we think this is important, right? That why these ADUs matter. And then on the sustainability side, similarly, I think we ought to be encouraging people to be putting in ADUs that have PV on the roof, that have all of the sustainable building materials that it can, that are avoiding, maybe looking at new refrigerant, approaches to cooling, approaches to refrigerators, water use, all the things. Because if you're going to spend $300,000 to $500,000 on an ADU, A, you want to keep your operating costs as low as possible, and B, if you have that kind of money, the marginal cost of making it a sustainable project or a more sustainable project is may not be a barrier for that particular ADU installer. So just throwing it out there, ways to get it cheaper and also ways to get it more sustainable and more equitable. But I think I do think it's helpful for us to lead with our values on this.
Great, thank you. We'll take that into consideration and see how we can fold that in throughout the handbook.
Great. Next, I'm going to turn to Vice Chair Raskin.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. Thank you for the great presentation. I've just got 2 points, and the first one is, I couldn't help but notice that in the ADU experience survey, only 4% of the respondents self-identified as non-white. We didn't have any responses from Black or Asian respondents, and so, I think, as we move forward, it's going to be important for us to reach out to members of those communities to see what their experiences are and to see if there are institutional barriers to them perhaps participating in these programs. So, as we move forward, I really hope we can find a way to collaborate with leaders of minority communities here in Santa Monica to get their input on this process. And second, one thing that's come up before is, we've been trying to find some data as to how many ADUs are being occupied as residential housing units and how many are being used as home gyms, home offices, etc. And I might have missed it, but I didn't see any data about that in the pack of materials. And I'm curious if you have any data on that, or if you could just tell me anecdotally what you're seeing, in Santa Monica and other cities throughout the region.
I could just quickly jump in real quick, Susan. Just as far as, through the housing element, if you might remember, we attempted to try to find out that data of like how many of these are actually being rented. Unfortunately, we just didn't get a high response, and we tried to even do our own due diligence, looking online, to try to find as much rental information as we could, and we just weren't coming up with enough to make any generalizations or assumptions. But we did attempt to do that work because that was also very interesting to us. And as you also might recall, there is also an additional housing element program that someone may allow. We will be allowing an additional ADU, so a second ADU on their lot, if they deed restrict it as a rental unit. So if someone takes advantage of that program through that deed restriction and kind of monitoring those, we will hopefully get some of that data through that program. But at the moment, we have been trying to figure all that out. And Susan, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add about any other cities you've come across.
I was just going to say the other two cities they have the same issue. They know very little about how the ADUs are being occupied and are struggling with that lack of data too.
Great, thank you very much. That's all I got.
Okay, well, my commissioners have brought up a lot of good points for you. I'm going to say something that's maybe a little counter, which is you started out by saying you wanted this for homeowners to digest. 60 pages, and there's a ton of detail. Not sure a homeowner digests all that information. So I know it's important to have as much detail in there as possible, but I just think at this point it's a little too long.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, right? On like being thorough, but making sure people actually read it. And that's why we try to incorporate pictures and diagrams and illustrations as much as possible, which did make the handbook longer, but we felt like sometimes that was an easier way to digest the information. But we've also have been thinking about that as well. It's a hard balance.
Yeah, it almost seems.
Honestly, it's come up in every city. Like, what is that balance? And different cities have had different reactions. And I think you're right that it's the audience is not just the homeowner; it's also the architect, and other people that might be involved in the entitlement process too. And so we were trying to straddle, potential variety of users or readers in this case. But we did know that there would be some percentage that really did need the extra information and would find it very valuable. And so then it brings up the question, do you have like a shorter handbook, like a 2 or 3 pager that's just the highlights, separate from the full handbook that other people might really value? And so I think there is opportunity potentially to have like the shorter version of it in the future that is really just geared towards someone who has a passing interest in an ADU or is maybe starting to consider it seriously, but they don't, want to read the full version. I think what we ended up landing on with, the cities too, is it's easier to have a more robust handbook and then cut it down if people feel like it's too long than give the city a shorter handbook that they're then scrambling to add more detail to down the road. So that's part of the reason why we landed on a more robust version, because it's easier to edit than add, if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I totally understand the conflict and the conundrum here. I would just urge you guys, as you're refining this, to keep in mind, are there areas we can streamline this even more?
If I can quickly add to that, through one of the kind of drafting stages we actually had originally some of the development standards were more filtered in throughout the handbook, and we ended up pulling all of those out into kind of individual pages per the different ADUs. So if someone maybe doesn't want to read the whole handbook, but they just want to take one of those last pages to be like, okay, well, what are the development standards for this type of ADU, that was kind of like an appendix to the ADU to kind of make it those, to kind of group all of those in one place as well. So there was some effort to pull out kind of maybe the most helpful things that could be more standalone instead of filtering them in pieces here and there throughout the handbook. So we did attempt to do that in some cases.
Great. Well, just, you're going to be spending another month and a half on this, and just keep that kind of at your forefront. That'd be great. Any other stat or commission comments at this point? And if not, I'm going to ask staff one more time. Any callers call in since we've been talking?
I haven't received any calls.
Okay, great. Well, unless you have any other questions for us, well, thank you very much for the presentation, and we'll look forward to December coming back with a final draft for us to look at.
Great. Thank you very much for the feedback.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate it.
Great. Have a good evening.
All right, you too.
Okay, we're going to close out that agenda item, and we're going to look at our agenda, and we see that we have nothing on item 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're going to move to 9, which is our continued discussion of the implementation of the 6th cycle housing element. And at this point, I'll turn it to staff to give us a little bit of an overview, and maybe highlight to us, staff, what you're anticipating getting done this evening. Give us an understanding of that. And I should also, let me ask this question first before you start. Commissioners, anybody need a break? I didn't ask last week. I just want to make sure everyone's good right now. I see nobody raising their hand. So we'll move forward, and then if you could open the call in queue, and then staff can go ahead and with the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Chair. So tonight we are actually just focusing on the loose and zoning map inconsistencies. That's how we wrote the agenda item per the schedule. As the Commission indicated in your last meeting, and you kind of wanted to, you thought that schedule was helpful in terms of providing focus for each meeting, and also making sure the community understands, this is a multi-meeting process, and we're using the same staff reports. We want to be clear about, what we're discussing on each night. So tonight, like I said, we're focusing on the loose and map zoning inconsistencies, and kind of have a brief presentation, but and it's actually attachment, I believe it's E on your agenda. I'm just double checking that actually. Yeah, attachment E. So there's a table, loose zoning inconsistency table, and we've also uploaded this presentation to the agenda. You have to refresh it just so you can follow along, because what we did is we actually converted that table into graphic, like a visual representation of the addresses. Recognize seeing an address on a table, you may not know like what intersection that is or what parcel we're talking about. We just wanted to make sure that that was clear to everybody. So we're continuing on this discussion of Group 1 of our housing element program implementation. And like I said, tonight is the loose and zoning map inconsistencies. And tonight is about kind of receiving your questions and feedback on the proposed recommendations for the amendments to the maps here. Again, coming back to the schedule, we're here now. November 2nd is our next meeting, when we will be talking about the AHPP and density bonus amendments. And I guess, depending on that, we can pull for a special meeting of the Commission on the 9th if we think we need it, in order to sort of wrap up the Group 1 discussion, kind of depending on where we go, because those are two kind of meaty topics. So in terms of the loose and zoning map inconsistencies, the table we provided to you identifies approximately 40 parcels that have been identified that have an inconsistency between the land use and circulation element land use designation and the zoning classification. So, it's an example where it's like, R1 zoning, but it's showing like low density residential, which would equate to like R2 zoning in the loose. And of those 40, 6 parcels are actually identified on the SSI, and the table has kind of there's a column that identifies which ones those are, and we've also identified that graphically in the presentation as well. And really, the proposed amendments here have been guided by changes in state law. If you recall, we actually started this project some years ago, actually. But there have been a lot of changes in state law that provide, I think, clearer guidance, in terms of what the city kind of has to do. There is SB 330, which, as we know, it prohibits reducing the intensity of land use. Some people say, it prohibits downzoning essentially below what was in effect as of January 1, 2018. And then secondly, state density bonus law. If someone pursues a state density bonus project, it requires that where there is an inconsistency between the general plan, land use designation, and zoning, that the greater shall prevail. So the recommendations in the table and what we would be happy to run through tonight, really follow that guidance in terms of, essentially not reducing the intensity of land use and, selecting kind of the greater of the two where there's an inconsistency. That's what is driving that here. So we wanted to make sure that was understood in terms of, where the proposed amendments came from. That's really the overview we have for you tonight. I do have every single one of these 40 parcels has a slide for each, and we'd be happy to run through each of those if that is helpful. Otherwise, if the commission would desire to have a more general discussion about this approach, we can also tackle it that way too, or if there's any questions. So maybe you can let us know, kind of how you want to proceed with that.
Jim, I think you're muted there.
Sorry. Okay, so Commissioner Fonda-Bernardi?
Yeah, so if you followed state law in making these adjustments to the zoning map, there's really nothing for us to decide. Is that correct?
That is, yeah, I mean, that's, I think, essentially what we wanted to explain. There's not a ton of discretion here. It's sort of, some of these decisions have been made for us. So,
right. So my question really then is, because these are changes, and there's 60 of them or whatever, there's 40 of them, is there a procedure when you're making a zone change to notify the neighbors that the zone now has changed? Does that follow automatically from these decisions, or does it just happen behind the scenes?
I mean, the noticing that's required for something like this, where in terms of our public hearing noticing procedures, when we need to notice more than 1,000 people, if you drew a radius from every single one of these parcels, we could easily hit that. Our noticing is, essentially a newspaper notice, publishing of the agenda, and the like. There's not sort of an individual notice, to immediately adjacent, like people touching the parcel lines, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think if that is certainly something we could do, we have, I think we have ownership information for most of these, or we can get it from, county assessor data, but that's not part of the typical noticing procedure. For zoning map amendments, they're typically handled through the procedures that are stated in the zoning ordinance.
Okay. Well, then I would move this topic, unless people have a particular parcel that's of concern. I would say we approve it.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions about the map? Yeah, way to get right to the point, Commissioner Fonda-Bernardi. Appreciate it.
Oh, and again, maybe we should open the lines for public comment again, just to be remember to do it for this one.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question? of the city attorney before we vote?
Yeah. Sure.
While we're waiting for public comment, in the interest of transparency, it occurs to me that we as commissioners may each happen to live or work within a radius of one or more of these addresses. I haven't done the Google Maps thing to see if it's actually accurate, but would there be any reason that we couldn't vote on this?
Well, I would say also just in terms of what is before you this evening on your agenda, it is simply a discussion item. You were to just kind of give direction to staff, so you don't really have to, there's no action to really be taken. There could be some direction to staff because this will be brought back to you for a resolution of recommendation at a future time when you would be making an actual formal recommendation and taking action.
And do we need to worry about it then?
Yes. I would. Well, we would need to check. I think it depends on how many parcels are affected and the radius issue. I mean, there's some factual analysis that we would be undertaking, right? Just given the number of parcels, if there's so we would encourage commissioners to reach out to our office with any questions you may have about that.
Okay. I mean,
You're good, John?
I think I'm good. No, I mean, I don't see that. I don't see that any of us are gonna. None of us have an interest, and none of this is necessarily going to affect our anything, as far as I'm aware. But I think it would be helpful well in advance of when we're going to vote on a resolution if staff could send us a little template that says, if any of the following applies, you should call us, right? Beyond, do you live or work within 500 feet or 1,000 feet or something, whatever the radius rule is, because it may or may not affect us, and we could probably save ourselves and staff some time if we can immediately count ourselves in or out based on what staff tells us. That makes sense?
Sure. Our office will work with staff on this issue. Okay. And again, I think it's probably expected to come back to you with everything else in January. So we'll work on that. And the planning manager can correct me on that, but I believe it's scheduled to come back to you in January.
Okay.
That is correct. Yes.
Okay. And just to be clear for anybody who may be watching this now or later, changing the zoning does not change the rent control status of this property. If a property is rent controlled now, it will be rent controlled later. Make sure people know that.
That's correct, yes.
And for the community's consumption, these zone changes will go with a noticing to the general, in paper. You will not get a specific notice. So you should pay attention to these so they don't surprise you in the future.
Yeah, correct. And that's why we posted the visual presentation to the Planning Commission's agenda. We will, I think we can probably post it to the website as well so people can see the picture of the parcel on the intersection and exactly which parcel is the subject of the change.
I think that's a great idea. Thank you. Okay. I think you're just looking for a straw vote here, or do you have what you need?
I think generally I'm not hearing a lot of objections, so you probably don't need a straw poll. I think we have a pretty good sense of the commission. That's probably what we need.
Okay. Great. Is it that simple tonight?
It is.
Okay. That's great news, but can I ask a favor for the next hearing? Can you come back to us with a map of your understanding of what we did last week in terms of where we allowed ground floor residential?
Yes, we can do that.
There was a lot of discussion, and I think there was a little bit of confusion afterwards that I heard about, so it'd be great to just get that out on the table.
Yeah, we will reflect back to you what we heard. It just wasn't a long time between last week and this week, so we're planning for November 2nd to provide the commission a full summary of October 12th meeting. You'll of course have minutes from that meeting as well, so that I know that people have been present and not present at these meetings, and it'll just kind of allow everybody to catch up and review on your on the sense of the commission.
Okay, great, thank you. So with that, we're going to close this. I'm going to ask one more time. We have no callers. We still have no callers.
Correct.
Okay, great. With that, I'm going to close out this agenda item, and I'm going to move to item 10, which is public input on any item not on our agenda. We could start a 1-minute timer for that. That'd be great.
And Chair, I have an agenda request I wanted to make for 2023. I just figured sooner rather than later.
I don't know that we formally have that on our agenda tonight. I'm open for you to make that suggestion, but we might have to come back on another night when we have it on the agenda.
No, yeah, I just want to put it in the hopper. Is that? Heidi, can we put an agenda request in the hopper?
Yes, so long as you're just asking for a future agenda item. You're not voting on it.
Yeah.
So you just be asking staff to consider bringing it back and talk to the chair about it. That's fine.
Yep. Okay, thanks. But I'll wait for public comment first.
We did not receive any calls.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Well, with that, we're going to end public comment, and I'll let Commissioner Landers add his agenda item before we adjourn.
Thanks. So at the risk of a headache that will only become more of a headache the longer we wait to talk about it, I think it would be really helpful sometime in 2023 for us to get a briefing on the Olympics. I have heard we will have some Olympic facilities in Santa Monica. City Council has already taken some steps to make that happen. We were part of the bid, but there are a lot of infrastructure considerations, and I have heard informally in conversations with people who deal with the intersections of various public agencies that it might be helpful for us to surface exactly what's going to happen between now and the appearance of a beach volleyball stadium on our slightly south of the pier, and the appearance of potentially thousands of people trying to get through our city in 2028. So I just want to ask that we have maybe a plan for how those pieces are going to, infrastructure pieces, construction pieces are going to play out over the next 6 years, and if you come back and say it doesn't have to be 2023 because it has to be early 24, that's great. But people are city and county and other staff are starting to really ramp this, and I think it would be helpful for us in Santa Monica to kind of have a briefing on what the timeline is.
Yeah, certainly we can take a look at that and see what we can bring back to you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I would just add that we are starting to look into that. Susan Klein, who is our assistant city manager, has been having a couple of meetings with the Olympic Committee. So those conversations are starting. I'm not sure at this point, when they might be ready to come to the commission, but I mean, sometime in 23 definitely sounds doable. So let me check in with Susan and then figure out when the best time is to touch base with the commission.
Thank you. I mean, I assume we're getting the pier bridge at some point. So, and that's time to the Olympics as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Just a talking point, as I understand it, it's north of the pier, the volleyball, not south of the pier.
Okay.
That's correct.
We cannot discuss it. We can only try to put it on our agenda in the future.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, folks, thanks for everyone's time. I'm going to adjourn this Planning Commission meeting at 8:15. You all have a great rest of your evening. Talk to you soon.